Good morning, everybody. My name's Adi Cooper. I'm here to talk about making safeguarding personal. I'm the independent chair of the City and Hackney Safeguarding Adult Board and also the Haringey Safeguarding Adult Board. I'm the Care and Health Improvement Advisor for the Local Government Association for London, and also I lead on safeguarding adults, and I'm a visiting professor from the University of Bedfordshire. So that's about me. I'll just move on to say what I'm going to cover this morning. So given that safeguarding adults became statutory with the Care Act and making safeguarding personal was incorporated into the statutory guidance, safeguarding is now promoted as personalised and outcome focused. This reinforces strength-based approaches to social work practice, and I'll be talking about that during this morning's session. There are some pauses for questions, but you can ask questions as we go through this. And at the end of the session, there are some questions that you can look at to reflect on your practice in safeguarding adults in the context of what I'm going to talk about. So just to start then, this is who I am. And then this is what I'm going to cover this morning: the types of abuse, the principles and the duties and responsibilities under the Act. And then to look at making safeguarding personal as a strength-based approach to practice. And then finally, a bit about risk and managing risk with making safeguarding personal. Please ask questions as we go through this morning. But as I say, there's a couple of points where we can stop if there are particular questions. So I'm going to start with the definition of safeguarding in the Care and Support Statutory Guidance. And breaking this down, we're looking at safeguarding in as a complex but actually quite simple way. So what is safeguarding? It's about people and organisations working together. So safeguarding by definition involves lots of different people. It's about preventing and stopping the risk and experience of abuse and neglect. So it's about prevention as well as protection. At the same time, making sure that the adult's well-being is promoted. So we've got to think always in the Care Act in terms of our statutory responsibilities about well-being as well as safeguarding. And this is the point that I would like to underline, that we have to, where appropriate, regard to the person's views, wishes, feelings and beliefs in deciding on any action. So what somebody wants to happen and how they feel about what's going on to them is absolutely critical and central. We need to listen to what people tell us about their lives and about risk and safety in their lives. So just moving on to the different types of abuse, which hopefully people are familiar with. The point about this list is not to go through it, but really to note that this is the list of types of abuse in the Care Act, but it's quite clear that it's not an exclusive list. So, for example, even during the drafting of the guidance, issues around scamming started to become quite prevalent. So there is now something in the guidance about scamming. We don't know, unfortunately, about the ways in which in the future people may or may not abuse and harm each other. Therefore, this is not an exhaustive list. But I would also draw attention to the types of abuse that were included in the Care Act guidance that were maybe not so familiar with previously. So modern slavery, for example, and self-neglect. And self-neglect was quite controversial because it's one of those areas where there isn't an external perpetrator. And so self-neglect has been quite difficult, I think, in some cases for people to get their heads around as a type of abuse in terms of safeguarding. So the Care Act did mark a shift in terms of what we consider is in the remit of safeguarding adults. So moving on to the principles, I think the first thing we need to note is the wellbeing principle, which, as I said, is absolutely threaded through the Care Act. And so anyone involved in any type of safeguarding activity needs to focus on improving the adult's wellbeing, as well as ensuring their safety and safeguarding. So that's a really key principle that we have to hold as central to any work that we do in safeguarding. And then I've also included some of the articles from the Human Rights Act, because in undertaking any safeguarding work, we need to have a human rights approach. And that's why these 3 articles are absolutely critical and relevant to any safeguarding activity that we might undertake. In terms of the statutory guidance, there are 6 safeguarding principles in the Care Act. People look at the first one as empowerment, so supporting people to make their own decisions as being where making safeguarding personal sits. But I would argue that making safeguarding personal as approach to safeguarding actually sits across all of the 6 safeguarding principles in the Care Act. So both in terms of prevention, taking action before harm escalates, or harm occurs or risk escalates. And actually, I think as a principle, preventing things from deteriorating or escalating is absolutely critical, rather than waiting until something becomes so awful that further action has to be taken, needs to be absolutely central to how we think about safeguarding. Proportionality, which people who are familiar with mental capacity legislation will be familiar with this concept around the least intrusive or restrictive intervention appropriate to the risks prevented. So we need to think, what's a proportionate response to the situation that somebody is facing? Protection obviously is absolutely key and critical as a principle, that we need to support people who need help in terms of being abused or neglected. Partnership as a principle is reflected in the definition. I've already talked about how everything we do in safeguarding, we do in partnership, both with the people we're working with, but also across services and communities. And whether that's detecting and preventing and reporting neglect and abuse, but also in protection planning, we have to work in partnership. And finally, accountability, which is really a principle for us who work in this area, about making sure that we are accountable for what we do, and that we enable people to challenge agencies for their responses to those at risk of harm, so that we're accountable to each other. And actually, as a Safeguarding Adult Board Chair, I take this principle very seriously, because that's part of my role, to hold partners to account at a strategic level for what they're doing in terms of safeguarding people in the area. The 6 safeguarding principles are then translated in the statutory guidance into I statements, which hopefully people are familiar with. So what do these mean? These are quite significant principles, but what do they mean to the people for whom we are working with? And I won't go through these all in detail, but I would say, for example, let's think about how do you translate something like accountability into an I statement, so the people that we work with understand the role of everyone involved in my life, and so do they. So even these key principles can be made accessible to people who we work with, in terms of understanding how we work and why we work in the way that we do. Okay, so moving on to the aims of safeguarding that are described in the Care Act. And again, these should be hopefully familiar to people, in terms of, at a strategic and operational level, that our purpose is to stop abuse and neglect where possible, that we want to prevent harm and reduce the risk of abuse and neglect. So that prevention and risk reduction imperative is there in the strategic and operational aims. That we want to safeguard adults in a way that supports them in making choices and having control about how they want to live. So here very clearly is the making safeguarding personal approach, that choice and control is critical to how we work in terms of safeguarding adults who are at risk of abuse or neglect. We need to concentrate on improving the life of adults concerned. So that's the well-being principle threaded into safeguarding. We have a duty to raise awareness in communities so that they can play a role alongside professionals. So in terms of prevention, that's a key driver, so that people can both help keep each other safe, but also know how to raise concerns when they're concerns about individuals within their communities. We have a duty to provide accessible information and support about how to stay safe and how to raise a concern. That goes alongside the public awareness and community's role. That's something that we should be continuously be promoting, how people can keep themselves safe, each other safe, and then where they have concerns, raise those concerns. And also finally, we need to address the causes of abuse and neglect. So why are people at risk, and what is it that we can do that actually manages those risks and eliminates those risks in their lives? But given this range of aims, you can see how the role of making safeguarding personal, how that approach is threaded through the safeguarding guidance in the Care Act. So in terms of specific statutory duties, there are 3 duties in the Act itself. That's what the section 42, 43 and 44 refers to. So the first one is to make inquiries or cause them to be made into the circumstances of abuse. And I'll come to that in more detail later in this presentation. The second statutory duty is to set up a safeguarding adult board in each local authority area. The third is to arrange a safeguarding adult review in certain circumstances, which is section 44. I'm not going to cover those 2 aspects of the duties and responsibilities this morning. Alongside that, there are duties for partners to share information and cooperate in order to protect adults experiencing or at risk of abuse and neglect. And this is something that people often struggle with, particularly with data protection and GDPR. It's really important that everyone understands that if there are safeguarding risks, you can share information, and it's better to share and be told off for not doing it than not to share and something awful to happen. So this is something I think that still hasn't quite permeated all areas of the partnership, but does certainly come up time and time again in safeguarding adult reviews as a key issue for why things have gone wrong. So that's why I wanted to emphasise the duty to share information and cooperate as being absolutely critical to how we work as professionals around safeguarding adults. Another duty that was introduced with the guidance is a duty to provide advocacy for people who need it during safeguarding work, because there is a recognition that this is a significant aspect of a challenge in their lives, and some people may not be able to or may need support through advocacy in the process of safeguarding work. And finally, I've got the final point is that making safeguarding personal is integrated into the guidance. So we started working on making safeguarding personal as a different approach to safeguarding practice in about 2008. So before the Care Act, we were promoting this as good practice. It was part of sector-led improvement. With the statutory guidance, it's now become something we must do as opposed to something that we should do. And that shift is really important. It's not a choice for us to adopt this approach. It's a duty and a responsibility. So that's the first section of the presentation. Are there any questions so far on what I've said? If you're in a group, or if you want to use this presentation in a group session, the second and third questions are: how do you apply that information to cases that you're working with? So I would ask you to reflect on, given a recent case that you've worked with, a person who you've worked with, how would you have applied any of those 6 safeguarding principles in practice? How would they have influenced how you've worked with them? Or can you evidence that you've worked in terms of those principles in that practice? So that's for you to consider at a later point. I'll move on to strength-based approaches to practice. So this slide comes courtesy of Lynn Romeo, the Chief Social Work for Adults, and she produced the slide looking at the whole range of strength-based approaches. At the end of my presentation, there are 3 slides that give you very short summaries of the different approaches, and you can look them up on the internet if you're unfamiliar with any of these. What I've done is add making safeguarding personal into this diagram. And the reason I've done it is because, as was evidenced in the forum, the round table that Lynn Romeo set up, and that I've referenced in the useful links. So in 2017, the Department of Health published a strength-based social work practice with adults roundtable report. And in that report, you'll see a whole section on making safeguarding personal. Because what I would suggest is that making safeguarding personal is a strength-based approach to working in safeguarding, that people live their lives with risks. We all live our life with risks, and safeguarding is a word that's used to describe the potential and actual risks in people's lives. So there is a generic safeguarding aspect in many people's lives. When we look at safeguarding in particular to the Care Act, which we've just talked about and I'll come to later, we're looking at safeguarding people who have care and support needs and are unable to protect themselves because of those needs. But safeguarding is a spectrum. There's a spectrum of safeguarding and risk issues in people's lives, and I would argue that any approach to safeguarding needs to have, in keeping with all the strength-based approach, focusing on the person and their community and what assets and strengths they have in bringing into the circumstances and situation, rather than just looking at deficits and needs. So when we say making safeguarding personal is about the outcome someone wants and working with them around choice and control, what are the strengths and assets that they bring into that situation? So if we look at some of the relevant writers in this area on the next slide, we've got quotes that were cited by Lynn in that document around what are the commonalities about how we understand strength-based approaches to practice. So the first one describes that people often are doing incredibly well in times of difficulty and use the resources they have available to them. Well, this is true for people in safeguarding circumstances, that they are at risk of whatever issues are going on in their lives in terms of abuse and neglect. There's often pain and shame associated with that, but they will be using whatever resources they have available to them to cope with those circumstances. And we need to acknowledge in the second point that people have survived to this point, not without pain, but with ideas, will, hopes, skills, and other people, all of which we need to understand and appreciate in order to help them. So understanding someone's journey, someone's narrative, what's behind where they've come from, that professional curiosity is absolutely essential to strength-based approaches to practice and to making safeguarding personal. And then in terms of so what, Salibi, who's the expert in this area, says that change can only happen when you collaborate with the client's aspirations, perceptions and strengths, and when you firmly believe in them. So we are, with the best will in the world, not going to succeed with our protection planning unless we work with people and their strengths and their perceptions around what's achievable in their lives, and work with them to support them, to keep themselves safe in terms of any protection planning that we might want to undertake with them. So what do we mean by making safeguarding personal? So making safeguarding personal is not a model. There isn't a set of policies and procedures about it. It's an approach. It's very simple. It arose from in the noughties from the observation that personalisation, which was taking root in adult social care, was becoming very well established in terms of supporting people to be involved and have choices and control about their social care needs, but that safeguarding somehow was seen as different and specialist and excluded from that. So making safeguarding personal was bridging the approach personalisation in adult social care with what we were doing in safeguarding practice. So it's very simple. It's about safeguarding being led by that person. So what do they want to happen? What will achieve the changes that they want in their lives? What will achieve the outcomes that they want? So it's person-led and outcome-focused. It supports a personalisation approach to practice generally, which is enshrined in the Care Act, about involvement and choice and control. And then the fourth point, which is about improving quality of life, well-being and safety, that our purpose is, as well as helping people keep themselves safe, to make sure that their quality of life is not compromised. So I came into making safeguarding personal as a director of adult social services, where we undertook in our safeguarding partnership a piece of work looking at the outcomes for people who'd been through a safeguarding process, and some interviews were done very carefully with people who'd been through that process. And what they told us was that that the majority said that they were safer, but they were more unhappy, that they were more restricted in their options and choices. And that message for me drove me into saying this is not the way we should undertake our safeguarding practice. This was in the noughties. We need to change it. And that's why I've been working on this for so long, is because I really believe that we need to work in a way that involves people, that shifts our culture of practice and approach to safeguarding adults, and now meets the Care Act statutory framework. So it's become, as I said, something that we must do rather than something that we should do in terms of good practice. So this slide really cross-references between the making safeguarding personal objectives or the aims, the approach, and how that is threaded through the Care Act guidance, the statutory guidance. And you'll see that this is an LGA and ADAS slide, and during the presentation there are a number of slides that are taken from the work that we've done with the LGA and ADAS on making safeguarding personal over a number of years. So the first point is that people have complex lives, and being safe is only one of the things that they want work for themselves. And so that leads us to think about how we should work with people to know what being safe means to them and how it can be achieved. That doesn't necessarily mean saying to someone, what outcomes do you want? Because outcomes is not necessarily a word that is easily understood, but is maybe saying to somebody, what would you like to happen? What do you think would help you feel safer? How would you like this harm or this abuse to be addressed? And it may be that there are a whole number of reasons why what might be best for them is not necessarily the thing that they want, or what we might think is best for them as professionals may not be the thing that they want to happen. And so we have to negotiate with them what is our professional views and what their views are of what they would like. The second point is around adults should be involved at the beginning of an inquiry and their views and wishes ascertained. So as soon as we start undertaking a formal Section 42 inquiry, we need to be saying, what is it that your views are? The third point is about people who lack mental capacity, and it's about the wishes of an adult who lacks mental capacity being of equal importance to someone with mental capacity. And this is an issue that has threaded through making safeguarding personal as an approach since we started, which is that people would say, well, AD, I can understand making safeguarding personal is a valid approach when we're working with people with mental capacity, but how can we do this if someone has fluctuating or lacks mental capacity? And I would point them to the Mental Capacity Act and say we have to find out what their views and wishes would have been from the people around them, or have it through an IMCA, through an advocate, to understand what might they have wanted, could they have been able to express that to us, so that we make sure that we are addressing their wishes, their needs, their views in the same way as we would with someone who has mental capacity. The next point is about how we plan with people about their safety and well-being. So in protection planning, we have to plan with the adult for their future safety and well-being. So any discussion needs to happen with people. The most significant change in practice that was achieved when I started working on shifting the culture and practice and safeguarding was achieved because people started inviting service users and their carers to meetings about them, which seemed to be quite shocking at the time, that you would actually have someone in the room when you were doing the protection planning, or maybe even more shocking, that you would go to their home to talk with them about what planning might be best to achieve their future safety and well-being. So involving people in a way that's meaningful in their own decision-making and planning is absolutely critical in terms of achieving a making safeguarding personal approach. The next point I pick up in terms of a chair of a safeguarding board, which is that one of my roles as the chair is to make sure that the boards understand the effectiveness of arrangements around assurance, that we get assurance, and we seek feedback from people who've been involved in inquiries. And there is a national voluntary data return around making safeguarding personal outcomes. It is only voluntary, so not everybody does it, which says, well, are those outcomes that are sought through safeguarding achieved? And that, for me, as a chair of two safeguarding adult boards, is probably one of the key elements of evidence that assures me that safeguarding is effective in terms of the people in the local authority areas that the boards cover. And then finally, that professionals and other staff should not be advocating safety measures that don't take account of the individual's well-being. So that balancing between the professional views and the well-being of the individual needs to be very clearly balanced and understood, and that someone's well-being needs to be evidenced in terms of the outcomes that are achieved through any safeguarding work. So the numbers in brackets, the number 14 refers to chapter 14 in the statutory guidance, and the numbers afterwards refer to the clauses in that statutory guidance. So this slide shows you how the Making Safeguarding Personal approach is threaded through the Care Act guidance in terms of the statutory guidance in that chapter. But then if we move on to practice, so moving away from the language of the guidance, and what do we actually do? So how do we approach safeguarding? So the first one is about enabling safeguarding to be done with and not to people. So this isn't a situation where the person at the centre is done to, feels that professionals are making decisions for them, not involving them. It's a shift from a process supported by conversations to a series of conversations supported by a process. So we still need the guidance that we have in policies and procedures, but they shouldn't dictate what they do. They are frameworks to support what we do, not dictate that. What we want to do is enable people to talk about what's important to them, to tell us what they want to happen, how they're going to be able to achieve the safety and security and well-being in their lives, and what we can do as professionals to support them to be able to do that. Making safeguarding personal is about placing the person at the centre and ensuring their wishes are discussed and agreed with them at the start and throughout the process. One of the things that we learned in the Making Safeguarding Personal work that we did through the years was that people change their minds. So what somebody might want at the beginning of a process may not be what they want as they go through the safeguarding process and as their options are explored. And so that concept of negotiated outcomes or flexibility through the process is quite critical. It's not just at the beginning, this is what's going to happen and that's definitely what will happen at the end, but that through the process, that's an ongoing conversation. That means talking with people about the options that they've got, and those options might change, and what they want to do. So what do you want to achieve? How do you want to achieve it? What would help you to achieve that? It's enabling people to resolve their circumstances, to recover from the abuse and neglect, and achieve the outcomes that matter to them in their life. So what do you want to be different? How do you want it to be different? How can we help you recover from the pain, from the harm, from the abuse? What can we do that will support you to improve the circumstances that you're living with, as well as the safety in your life? So that's the final bullet point, is that balance between improving quality of life as well as safety, so that our emphasis in what we're trying to support people to do is improve their circumstances, both in terms of well-being and safeguarding and safety. So how we record that is really important. So here I might do a rant about recording. So we don't necessarily have IT systems that help us with this, but it's really important to record what people say in their words about what they want to do and what they want to achieve, because then firstly, it validates what they're telling us. If we write it down, it's a validation that we've heard what they've said. We can also then come back to that and see how effective our work has been. How helpful have the responses to abuse or neglect been? How much have we been able to achieve the outcomes that they've articulated that they want? If we don't write it down, it's not happened. If we don't write it down, we're not validating what people are telling us. And the single message that I get from people when I ask them, what would you like safeguarding practitioners to do differently? The single message is listen to what we're telling you. So if we write it down, we can show that we've listened to what people have told us, and we've really taken that into account when we've worked with them to safeguard them and develop protection plans. So end of rant on safeguarding recording, but I think it's really important to be mindful of that. So this slide is also about what we've learned around making safeguarding personal in practice over the years that we've been promoting this approach to safeguarding work. So the first thing is that we do need to use our professional skills. And by professional skills, that's not just social work skills, that's the skills of a whole range of professionals in the context of safeguarding practice, rather than put people through a process. And what's emerged certainly from safeguarding reviews over the last few years is that we need to use professional curiosity to understand the circumstances of someone's life. So not accepting at face value necessarily what people are telling us, but understand what's behind what they're telling us. And use professional curiosity to ask questions to try and understand why someone is in the circumstances they're in, which will then help us use our professional skills to support them better. The second bullet point came out of the Making Safeguarding Personal Temperature Check in 2016-17, where we talked to a lot of people, over 75% of local authorities in England. And what we found was that some people were interpreting making safeguarding personal in a very simplistic way, i.e. when somebody said to them, no, I don't want your help, they walked away, they didn't take any action. And this links a bit to the professional curiosity aspect as well. So that when someone says, no, I don't want your help, we don't just walk away. We don't think, okay, fair enough, they're living with risk and abuse or neglect, but we're not going to do anything. But we think about, well, what is it? Why is it that they're saying no? What are the reasons why? Why might they be pushing away for help? Where are their duties of care, public interest, or risk to others that may mean that we have a very specific reason for saying, no, we can't just walk away from the situation. We have to take action. We have to do something differently about it. And we've looked at that in some detail, and we've produced recently, it's just gone on the website, a document called Myths and Realities of Making Safeguarding Personal. It's just come out literally in the last few days on the website. And the first myth that it looks like is walking away when people say, no, we don't want you to help us in our lives. And we've developed this document for people to use in their teams with their colleagues to think about what are your local myths about making safeguarding personal, and what might you want to do in terms of challenging some of that, because we have found that people have misinterpreted what making safeguarding personal practice is about. And this document, it was to help people to explore some of those issues and clarify some of the approaches in making safeguarding personal. So moving on in terms of our understanding of making safeguarding personal, which is shifting as practice continues, we found that developing legal literacy to understand what options might be appropriate to support someone to keep safe is absolutely critical. Now, this doesn't mean that everyone has to be a lawyer, but we have to understand how different legal frameworks, not just the Care Act, may be helpful in terms of supporting someone to keep themselves safe from abuse and neglect. The next bullet point about the Mental Capacity Act is something that, again, comes out from safeguarding adult reviews again and again, that making safeguarding personal is also about competent practice in understanding and applying the Mental Capacity Act, that someone's ability to make decisions, to make choices is affected by their mental capacity, and that mental capacity can be affected not just by dementia or mental health problems, but also by coercion and coercive control, by physical illness, by circumstances and contexts in which people are living in. So I think we need to be clear around mental capacity, that it is a journey that we're still on in terms of understanding fully what impacts on executive decision making, and it's something that's absolutely critical in terms of safeguarding practice. So someone has asked a question that if someone says no and we persist, don't we run the risk of ignoring their voice or being seen as aggressive? And I think this is a really helpful question, because the nuances of how we work with someone who says no or who literally shuts the door in our face is quite complex. We don't ignore their voice. We take on board what it is that they want, but we need to be clear with them why we have to take action or why we need to act in a particular way in terms of their circumstances. And so the way in which we do that can manage down any concerns about being aggressive. I would signpost you to another document that's recently been published on the Local Government Association website, which is a series of case studies. And in those case studies, there are some really good examples of where someone hasn't accepted a professional's judgment, and over time that was negotiated. This was particularly about financial abuse, where the financial abuse was the daughter, a teenage daughter, financially abusing her father, and to the extent to which he had to go to the food bank. And the social worker reflects on how he or she managed that circumstance in a very nuanced and sensitive way. So I am saying that this is not easy, but there are ways in which we can say no without ignoring what people's views are and managing it in a way that isn't seen as aggressive. But it's tricky. Safeguarding is tricky. If it was easy, we wouldn't be sitting here now. So I'm going to move on to supporting unwise decisions and enabling risk appropriately to someone's personal circumstances, and say this is a really tricky area of practice, but it's something that we need to be able to balance sensitively and in a very nuanced way to understand how people can protect themselves in risky situations, and in decisions making that maybe we as professionals see as unwise. So, for example, the father in the case I just quoted, allowing his daughter to steal from him, I would consider as a pretty unwise decision, but how that was managed in a way that was proportionate and appropriate to his circumstances is described really well in that case study. So the final two bullet points are really for senior managers and leaders about understanding that making safeguarding personal practice is about frontline practice primarily, but it's also only able to happen if there's a supportive organisational culture with strategic and management leadership that supports this approach. And that was a message that we had very loud and clear very early on in making safeguarding personal, that people would say, well, we see this as the right way to work, but we need our senior managers to support us in terms of things like supporting unwise decisions and enabling risk. And so it's something that we say and would argue that boards and senior officers in organisations need to be consciously and overtly supporting this approach to practice. And finally, something that was brought out very clearly in the temperature check a couple of years ago was that everyone involved in safeguarding needs to adopt a making safeguarding personal approach. It's very difficult when you're in an area which is fundamentally about partnership working, if partners have different approaches to their safeguarding practice. And if some people are more risk averse or less risk averse, or some people are more procedural and less practice orientated, or where there are ways that people are working that maybe are not helpful in adopting a making safeguarding personal approach. And so a lot of work that we've done over the last few years through the Local Government Association has been with partners like with the police, with health, with housing, with other sectors, to try and help them understand what making safeguarding personal means for their practitioners and their sectors, so that we can achieve an approach that's common across all partners involved in safeguarding, and not only within the local authority as the lead agency. And that's something that will affect and does affect people on the ground and in practice in safeguarding people day in, day out, that some partners have less are less person-centred, less outcome focused than others. But I do see that as shifting and changing over time. So I'm going to come back to the Care Act, because I think that making safeguarding personal is something that we need to apply as an approach when we think about our specific duties under Section 42, and the work that we've done more recently about how Section 42 is in these two separate stages, reminding people what the Care Act guidance says about how we undertake safeguarding inquiries. So the first thing is to say that concerns are raised whether there's a reasonable cause to suspect that an adult, first of all, has care and support needs, or is experiencing or at risk of abuse and neglect, and as a result of those needs can't protect themselves. And that first stage of the process is about information gathering. So if we look at the next slide, which is taken from the statutory guidance, what does it say about this stage of the safeguarding process? It says that at the core is a discussion with the individual or their representative, which confirms that there's a cause for concern and agrees the outcomes wanted and the action to be taken. So in that information gathering, we need to talk to people about what is it that they're concerned about, and what is it that they would like to happen that could be different. And that's regardless of whether we're going to progress the work into a Section 42 inquiry under Section 42(2). So in this stage of the process, we need to talk to people. So one of the red rags for me when making safeguarding personal that tells me that making safeguarding personal hasn't been adopted is when I hear that people are subject to safeguarding processes and they don't know about it. They don't know why they've been referred or why somebody has come into their life. Fortunately, that seems to be happening less and less, but it is an indicator that people aren't talking with them about what's going on in their lives, or with their representatives if they haven't got mental capacity with the people around them to manage those safeguarding risks. So it's the other reason why this information gathering stage is so important, is that this is, from a prevention point of view, the point at which people can be helped to keep themselves safe. So prevention is very much the focus of information gathering, because you can, through that information gathering, be signposting people to various other areas for support or for advice or for information. And you can be resolving a problem, helping that person resolve the risks in their life without it escalating or becoming more serious. So this stage of the process for me is very much about prevention, and it's a valid stage of the process. People have told us that they don't feel that it's as valid because it's not counted. And for those of you involved in data and performance issues, the NHS Digital Current Safeguarding Adult Returns doesn't really concern itself with this stage of the process, which people then feel is not validating that so much safeguarding prevention work is done here. And I suppose I want to emphasise this point because I'm hoping that they'll change and that the ways in which we gather information nationally will really shift to validate this as a critical part of safeguarding practice. So given this information this information gathering stage, the robust information that you gather at this stage will then, if we go back to the previous slide, show whether or not there's reasonable cause that someone needs a safeguarding inquiry under the second stage of this clause. So that's under section 42.2, that then you make inquiries or cause inquiries to be made, which then inform you about what action is necessary, and if so, what and by whom. And I would say that this isn't necessarily a linear process. So you might do some information gathering, start making further inquiries, decide that actually it's not a section 42.2 decision. It doesn't matter. What's most important is that you're working with the person and trying to help them keep safe and decide what action is necessary and by whom. So if we move on to the next slide, what does the guidance say are the objectives of a section 42.2 inquiry? So, to establish the facts, to critically ascertain the adult's views and wishes. So here we see making safeguarding personal absolutely central to the objectives of a safeguarding inquiry. To assess the needs for protection, support and redress and how they might be met. And to protect from the abuse and neglect, to protect the person from the abuse and neglect in accordance with the wishes of the adults. You can't do this unless you talk to them about what they want. This stage of the process is to make decisions about what action should be taken, what should be done in respect of the person or organisation responsible for the abuse and neglect. And then finally, I think this is the most important objective in an inquiry, is what is going to enable the adult to achieve that resolution and recovery from whatever abuse and neglect they've experienced. And we aren't going to be able to do that unless we've understood what it is they wish and what their views are in order to be able to achieve that. So we need to work with them and with other agencies, depending on what the nature of that abuse or neglect is, to work out what's best going to be able to help them achieve that resolution and recovery. So I have a question here about, or a comment about misconceptions and a superficial understanding of making safeguarding personal, and hopefully what this presentation does and what the Myths and Realities paper does is help people understand that making safeguarding personal isn't a simplistic, just listen to what someone says and does it, but is much more complex about how we work with people through the complexities and challenges in their lives to understand where they've come to, going back to strength-based approaches to practice. What do they bring? How have they survived to this point? What do they bring with them? And how do we work with them to help them keep themselves safe and achieve the objectives and aims in terms of safety and well-being? I agree with the comment that we need to shift our assumptions about how safeguarding works. I'd say at this point an anecdote that may or may not be helpful to people. I gave a presentation on making safeguarding personal to a group of people who were doing some work on safeguarding and risk in mental health services. And it involved a large group of service users and service user representatives. And I was talking with them about making safeguarding personal and this approach to safeguarding practice. And I quoted Professor Jill Manthorpe, who is very prolific in safeguarding work and writing about safeguarding. And Jill had said to me at some point, she's been involved with the Making Safeguarding Personal program, project, approach, work for a number of years. Jill said to me, Ada, you know that culture change takes 18 years. Now, I trust her because she's a professor, that she's got an evidence-based for making that statement. And at that point, when I was talking to these service users, this was a few years ago, we'd maybe been going for about 7 or 8 years. And I said, well, so the shift in assumptions about safeguarding and how we approach safeguarding, cultural shifts aren't quick. It's not a quick fix. It's slow and complex. But what those service users said to me was, Adi, we can't wait for 18 years for this to change. And so that's what keeps me driving on about shifting our approach to practice, because for the people who we are working with, for them, they need us to be using this approach in the way in which I've described it today, now, not in 8 years' time. So I would really urge you to promote and use the resources that I'm talking about in your teams and in your situations to shift assumptions about how people understand safeguarding, and particularly how people understand making safeguarding personal. So please use this information and briefing in your teams and with your colleagues. I will come back to the next slide, which is coming back to this whole issue of people walking away, and gives you a bit of statutory robustness to what the legal framework is for how we consider where we might intervene when someone doesn't want us to intervene. So this is in effect the legal, this is your legal backup for why you might take action that is not necessarily what the person wants. So it's in the Care Act where it talks about, the Care Act guidance, where it talks about people who refuse assessment. And it says that if someone refuses assessment, the local authority doesn't have to carry out the assessment, except in certain circumstances. And those circumstances that you must carry out a needs assessment are basically if the person lacks capacity to refuse the assessment and the local authority thinks that carrying out the assessment is in their best interest. So that links back to the Mental Capacity Act and our need to work in people's best interests. But also it excludes if the adult is experiencing or is at risk of abuse or neglect. So under the Care Act, we can do a Care Act assessment if someone is at risk of an abuse and neglect, even if they're refusing support. So that's your basis for not walking away. It's a clear principle that helps us. And as I've said earlier, making safeguarding personal isn't about walking away. It's not about being aggressive and imposing a professional judgment, but it does give us the option of carrying out work even when someone may refuse it, if we think and we can evidence that it is something that we need to do and there is a reason for doing that. So I'm just going to pause here and say, if you're using this presentation in a group setting or with colleagues, that these are the questions that I had thought that it may be helpful to think about in terms of your own practice. So thinking about what someone you've worked with recently, what their strengths and assets were, what did they bring to the table, what were the things that helped them to survive, to be resilient, to live their lives to the point at which you have worked with them. And then what were the safeguarding as well as well-being outcomes that they or their advocates had identified? So what did they want out of the work that you were doing with them? And then whether those outcomes were achieved. And if they weren't, what might have been the blocks and barriers to achievement? So as a reflection, thinking about making safeguarding personal as a strength-based approach to practice, and it doesn't matter if this is a Section 42 inquiry or not, this can be any aspect of risk or abuse in somebody's life or neglect. What were the ways in which you worked that may have acknowledged their strengths and assets and identified their outcomes? So those would be the questions that I would ask you to think about if you were reflecting on making safeguarding personal as a strength-based approach to practice, and how you might consider that in terms of your work. So moving on to risk and risk assessment, there's a very useful chapter. So I've taken this from a chapter by Emily White in a book that Emily and I edited called Safeguarding Adults Under the Care Act, Understanding Good Practice. It's published by Jessica Kingsley. And Emily talks about making safeguarding personal and the approach to risk and risk assessment. And these are some of the things that I'm sure are very familiar with you, but it helps think about what we consider when we're thinking about risk and risk assessment. That there's a balance between autonomy and protection, and that will be different for each individual in terms of the circumstances in their life. And that's the fundamental balancing act that we do every time we think about risk and risk assessment and safeguarding for somebody who has care and support needs. The second bullet point is a very well-known quote by Justice Mumby, which really speaks to the well-being principle in the Care Act and how that's threaded through safeguarding. So he said, what good is it making someone safer if it merely makes them miserable? And it's quite a succinct quote and captures for me something that we need to always keep in mind when we're thinking about risk and risk assessment. The third bullet point is about thinking about a rights-based approach to safeguarding and risk assessment, and this links to strength-based approaches. So in the way we think about risk and risk assessment, what are the assets that people bring? What are the assets they bring as themselves, in their families, in their communities? What are the strengths that they bring in terms of the protective factors when we're thinking about risk and risk assessment? Then we need to consider a whole range of risk assessment tools, and we did try and come up with a Making Safeguarding Personal risk assessment tool, but nobody could agree on it, so I'm not going to promote one or against another here. There are several that we promote through the LGA website as examples of good risk assessment tools, but what they have in common is that they provide a framework. They don't tell you what to do. I think that's really important. They provide a framework to think about severity. What's the severity of risk? What's the likelihood of risk? What impact does it have? And then what that helps you do is think about, well, how might you eliminate or minimize those aspects? So you might minimize severity or be able to minimize likelihood. You might be able to eliminate one or the other, but you're unlikely to be able to eliminate risk completely from somebody's life. So therefore, how might you minimize the different aspects of risk in someone's life? And these tools are really useful because they give you a framework to make an assessment, but they complement professional judgment. They don't make the decision for you. What they do is give you a framework to think about risk that then encourages you to review and reflect on that risk, rather than that tool provides you with an answer. And I think this final point is about recognizing that the organization that you work with, the organizational culture, will affect your approach to risk and what you may or may not be able to do in terms of a specific person's experiences. And if you don't recognize that impact, then it will affect your practice. So this is a point that I make to senior leaders and partners around how leaders in organizations and senior managers model an approach to risk is so important for frontline staff to understand what the parameters, in fact, of how they manage and support risk and risk assessment are doing. So a practitioner is in risk looking at what's critical for evidencing the basis for your judgment and the tools that help you do that, and the importance of recording how you've arrived at your conclusions. So someone has just raised an issue where she worked with someone where the children were a protective factor. However, during a period, someone turned 18 and changed that relationship. I think it's really helpful to understand how things do change over time and how critical events can change the dynamics in a family, and particularly in terms of safeguarding adults. So what might be a protective factor at one point may not be at another. So that goes back to the fluidity of people's lives and the complexity of people's lives, and how we must always be mindful that what might be okay at one point in time may not be at another point in time. So thank you for that comment. That's really helpful. I will just say something else here again, a rant about recording. So recently a case was brought to me about a man with dementia who was supported to live at home but was wandering and actually died, I think, while he was he had left his home. And the coroner was very critical of the quality of the decision making. So this gentleman's family were absolutely supportive of him living in supported accommodation. It was where he wanted to be. He didn't want to be locked in a deprived of his liberty. This is what he wanted. This is what his family wanted. But the coroner has been quite critical around the evidence for that balance of risk and risk assessment not being as clearly recorded as it should have been. So I think it emphasizes for me that this balancing act that practitioners have to take around autonomy and protection, around what's in someone's best interests, what their strengths are, what their views are about the outcomes they want in their lives, the importance of writing down how that balancing arrives at a particular decision, what the family's views are, is absolutely critical, not just for when things go wrong, but also to record your professional judgment around the situation that you're dealing with, that it shows your skill and your knowledge with the information that you've got about what it is that you want to achieve with that person, what that person wants to achieve in their life. Let's move on to just showing you the simple model that Emily, as I said, has around undertaking a risk assessment. So the first stage she suggests is understanding the person's wishes and feelings in relationship to the risk that they're experiencing in their lives. So what do they think about it? What are their views? What are their feelings? Understanding the impact of the risks on that person. So that case I mentioned earlier in the MSP case studies of the gentleman whose daughter was stealing all his money, the impact of that was he was going to a food bank to get food. So quite significant risks in terms of him not having enough money even to feed himself. And then the next stage of the risk assessment is enabling and responding to that risk. So what would be the response to that? What's a proportionate response that someone would want to take? So he at first refused to stop giving his credit card to his daughter. So that might have been a good thing to do, but he wasn't able to do that. So then what planning and contingency is there? In that case, they ended up setting up 2 bank accounts, one which maintained enough income for him to be able to meet his basic needs, and another bank account which he was able to let his daughter use and be able to use his money for her needs. So that was an uncomfortable compromise for the practitioner, but it was a risk management plan, given that the risk was financial abuse and the impact of that was quite severe on his life. That was something that he was able to comply with, and it gave him the ability to manage his life, but also not risk his daughter would stop visiting him and lose a contact, which was absolutely critical. He said to the social worker, this was the most important thing in his life, was his relationship with his daughter. So how do you balance those risks and the person's wishes and feelings whilst maintaining that they are safe, as in he has enough money to maintain his basic needs? So Emily gives a very simple model. People may have local policies and procedures that would provide tools to help you understand and undertake a risk assessment in your own work. So if you have time at some point to reflect on this, these would be the additional questions that I'd ask you to think about in terms of the risk in someone's circumstances with a person that you've worked with recently. So what was the level of severity? What was the likelihood? What was the impact? That very simple risk analysis tool. But then critically, what did they think about the risks? Did you ask them? What did they say? What was the impact of the risks on them? What did they think they were? Did they even see the impact of the risks on them? How then did you work with them to respond to those risks and plan with them to reduce those risks? And then finally, what did you achieve for them? What were the outcomes in terms of their safety and well-being? What were they able to achieve when you've worked through those issues with them? So that's something for you to consider if you want to use this for a group or in reflection on your own casework. So I'm just going to move on to the resources that I've mentioned at the end of the presentation. I've talked about making safeguarding personal resources. That's the website at the local government association, which provides a whole range of tools and briefings and information about making safeguarding personal. The things that are new this year, which are some are on that website, some not quite yet on that website, but you need to go and look for them, is a new edition of the toolkit, which really picks up on strength-based approaches to practice. So it's completely different to our previous MSP toolkit and cross-references a whole range of strength-based approaches to practice in safeguarding. The case studies, which I've mentioned already during the presentation, there are 9 case studies, quite detailed case studies that can give you examples of good making safeguarding personal practice in safeguarding, because people have said to us, it's all very well having safeguarding adult reviews telling us what goes terribly wrong, but how do we know what good looks like? And so one of our focuses in the MSP program has been to try and produce information that shows what good looks like. We also have a series of 11 podcasts which are coming out, which will be probably on the RIPFA website. And those are interviews with Essie Hardy, who is an expert by experience, and Michael Preston-Shute, who is a ex-professor of social work, but also chair of several safeguarding adult boards, talking about safeguarding and making safeguarding personal. And there is also the Myths and Realities paper, which I've shown you on making safeguarding personal, which is on the website. We've been doing a lot of work recently about decision-making on safeguarding adult inquiries, and you've got the web links to that, and I've referred to that earlier when I talked about the section 42.1 and the section 42.2 about clarifying those different stages of the process and how making safeguarding personal is impacted and influences our approach to safeguarding practice throughout the process. The next slide has got some useful resource links. So you've got a reference to the book as well as the Department of Health guidance. Jane Lawson, who works with me on making safeguarding personal and has done for several years, has done a piece for community care and written a whole load of resources for community care inform on making safeguarding personal. And you've got the references to the strength-based social work practice paper that Lynn Romeo developed a couple of years ago. There's also references to Working with Risk for Safeguarding Adults Board, to the Social Care Institute of Excellence and the LGA Knowledge Hub that has a whole lot more information around safeguarding and making safeguarding personal. And then finally, I've just given you 3 slides that go through some of the strength-based approaches that can support making safeguarding personal. So firstly, restorative approaches, which is based on restorative justice methods. And there is a whole chapter in the book that Emily and I edited around restorative justice and safeguarding and making safeguarding personal, about how you work with people around achieving recovery in relationships where abuse is between individuals. Similarly, family group conferencing, which is an approach that comes from New Zealand, is much more well known in children's services, but also has been used in adult services and adult safeguarding, and has been promoted through making safeguarding personal for a long time around helping people arrive at decisions about family. And by that, I would say family can be networks. It's not necessarily just family, to help people to keep safe in their lives. The 3 conversations model, which can apply to safeguarding and certainly promotes a making safeguarding personal approach, because you need to ask people what they want to do and what they want to happen and what outcomes they want in their lives. So I would argue that it supports making safeguarding personal. On the next slide, we've got solution-focused work, which helps people to have the capacity to discover their own solutions by asking questions for people to help them identify what they want. Narrative approaches, which is about seeking to understand people rather than the problem. And there is a chapter on narrative approaches in the book that talks about safeguarding and making safeguarding personal in that context. We've got person-centered approaches, which I would also say is very supportive of making safeguarding personal. Systemic social work, so understanding people in terms of their contexts, and appreciative inquiry as a way of inquiring and developing questions and discourses to understand what might work for someone in terms of a safeguarding practice. I've also included a couple of community-based approaches in terms of making safeguarding personal, because we would argue that making safeguarding personal is also about involving communities and people in safeguarding, and that capacity building in communities is absolutely critical in terms of prevention agendas in safeguarding. So you've got asset-based community development and local area coordination, all of which are about promoting resilience in communities, which by definition promotes and supports the making safeguarding personal approach. So thank you everyone who's joined. Hopefully this will be useful for you, and you will be able to, it would be lovely if you were able to use the presentations in your teams or with your colleagues to be able to promote making safeguarding personal in whatever context that you're working with. So thank you for joining us this morning, and please continue to make safeguarding personal for the people that you work with.